Hello and welcome to FinTech Impact. I'm your host, Jason Pereira. Today on the show, I have a company revisiting in Conquest Planning. Specifically today, I have Brad Joudrie, Chief Revenue Officer of Conquest, coming back for a second visit, and Ken Lotocki, Chief Product Officer, coming for his first. And they're come back on the show to talk about what we can call their meteoric rise in the last time for this last conversation, because a lot has happened in about 2.5 years, I think, is roughly when they were on. So we're going to talk about the changes, the growth, and the challenges those are presented. And with that, here's my interview. Gentlemen, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Jason. Good to be back.
Yeah, and literally coming in. Like, this is the first meeting I recorded in this boardroom for, oh my God, since, definitely 2018. Or 2019. So crazy. All right.
It's the opposite of Buckner walking back into Shea, right? Like this is one of those good situations.
Buckner
we're happy to be here.
Gets the applause every time. Anyway, so gentlemen, let's start off with a recap of a little bit about Conquest Planning and its origin story. So let's start there.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll again, thank you, but turn it to Ken. Ken's one of our founders and chief product officer. So maybe Ken can start there.
Sure. Thanks, Brad. So with early on of the days of Conquest or pre-Conquest, it was really conversations that 7 founders were having. A lot of it was with Mark Evans, our president and CEO, going, there hadn't been a lot of innovation in the space since we left. I think everyone's kind of aware of our background and where we came from. A lot of us stayed in the space and kind of are aware and on top of what's happening, and hadn't seen a lot of improvements in the tech stacks that are out there and the technologies that are out there. And, we approached or got together, and basically it was, how can do we want to do this again? And how could we do this again? And we had some ideas that we were kind of floating around. But really what happened was, I think what really hooked everybody is 2 stats, and the fact that, around the world, people are still dramatically underserved when it comes to financial plans. And 2, I think we took almost as a personal objective or a personal goal, which was the fact that it just takes far too long to build a financial plan and incumbent technologies today.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Kitz's benchmarks that at roughly 10 hours and with a very large distribution that skews to the longer term.
And we built one of those products that was actually one of the high bars in that graph that he has in that particular article.
And specifically, just stop here for a quick second and talk about the lack of innovation. So you started Conquest roughly when? What year was it?
2018.
Yeah. So, I mean, we look back at what quote unquote innovation we saw in the industry prior. And yes, there was a move to the cloud that happened early 2000s, which everybody adopted and moved to. Well, not everybody, but most have adopted and moved to. And then I think, I'll give Edmund Walters credit, who's been on the podcast before, in bringing data aggregation to financial planning software. That I think was the last big innovation I saw before you guys came along. But for all intents and purposes, software hasn't evolved much, even from the desktop stage, which was, here's some sort of interface to input data. Now play with it so that it looks better, right? And that's really the crux of it. And so we'll talk about how you've gone beyond that and evolved that and dealt with those issues. But okay, so you started off identifying that need, and you knew what the landscape looked like. What were your first thoughts on what you could do? Because I want to come to where you actually landed as differentiation.
Our first thought was how, actually was even taking it further back. Our first thought was really, there's a lot in every other profession out there, and we see, in terms of innovation, whether it's medical profession or legal profession or so on, there's more and more tools that are being built to help make it easier for that professional essentially to do their job. And financial planning is specifically building that plan. There wasn't anything like that that's out there. Traditionally, the plans have been built, it's either goals-based or cash flow planning. And there's an area to go to build the financial plan, which is all well and good, assuming you're trained really well as that advisor. But there's your 10 to 17 hours right there. So how can we and what could we do to make it easier to cut down that time, to take a lot of the guesswork, take a lot of the almost like the training and the rework that goes into building a plan? What can we do that? And that's really where the seeds were planted in terms of the genesis of what eventually became our strategic advice manager.
Actually,
I would add actually one more thing, and it kind of blends into that vein of the strategic advice manager. But one of the key tenets of the solution when we first built it was something that a consumer could better digest. And I think that's been a challenge in the industry for a number of years. The whole discussion about, a consumer bringing the shoebox, the advisor going behind a curtain, coming out with this magic 300-page report that would be the solution. Consumer then asks for a change, advisor runs back behind the curtain, prints off another 300 pages. It was a messy process. And so from the get-go, the introduction of SAM, making it more efficient for the advisors. Also, we wanted to provide that clarity to clients so that it would be easier to engage them in the process sooner.
Yeah. And I'd say a couple of things. We'll get to SAM in a second, but you're right. honestly, I always went behind the curtain. I mean, I know some advisors will pull stuff up and do stuff in front of them, but I always found that devalued, right? Because the reality is, especially cases that are more complex, like there's too many moving pieces to like, I'm just going to alter this one thing. Now that one thing alters a lot of stuff and I got to be sure that it works. So yeah, it's a very, and the problem is that of course, let's talk about all the tropes, right? The like 200-page report, right? Because you're trying to prove that you know something, right? Which has led to the wave of single-page financial plans, which might be taking it too far the other way as a compensation factor. And frankly, more importantly, the jargon, right? Like there's just so much, like everything is like, you need to do this really complex thing and I'm going to explain it in 2 sentences versus what you guys have done and your library of strategies that can be built, which is, it's simple. Delay your government pension, right? Like save for retirement. Everything is in layperson's terminology and carries through the entire thing. So that was one of the things that sometimes people say, this looks simple. It's like, well, yeah, but that's the point, right? So Sam, let's talk about Sam because Sam is the star of the show and when it comes to this.
Sam is the star of the show.
So strategic advice manager.
So again, and Brad is correct, and you're correct too, Jason, just in terms of the other part of Sam is trying to build strategies in such a way to help advisors work with their clients and understand exactly what's being recommended to them. And so all of that went into the conversation of what Sam could be. Mark has his PhD was in artificial intelligence from the University of Manitoba. And I think this was an opportunity as we started thinking more and more about what Conquest could be. This was an opportunity to invest, at least embed a form of AI into the planning process. And so what Sam really does, and I think you're well aware of it, and we've talked about it before, but for those who aren't, Sam is an expert system. It's rules-based. It's built to understand the data in a plan. So essentially who the client is, what the client has. Their goals are very important as part of it. And then we put an element in it we call planning preferences, which is really questions that the advisor typically would ask their clients anyways, or if they're potentially using some of our self-directed technologies, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit, let them answer and have a say into some things that are important to them as part of building that plan. And so Sam takes all of that information, creates an action item, creates a strategy list that's ranked and prioritized, not necessarily on the impact to the plan, how it's going to solve the goal, but more specifically on what's in the best interest of the client. And that's really key. And so for us, going back to that point about, making it easier for the advisor, but also doing it in such a way that the advice they're communicating to their client, Sam is working on behalf of the client and helping the advisor. And what's actually come out of it too, in terms of another way that we even think about Sam, is a nice analogy that we've been working with, which is if the advisor is the golfer, Sam's the caddy. Mm-hmm. So, the advisor's going to hit the shot.
That does work. Yep.
But the caddy knows the lay of the course, knows the skills, knows the club speed, knows which club to hit, knows the distance to the thing. But in the end, it's the advisor, in this case, the golfer, is hitting the shot.
So I want to dive a little deeper on this and just kind of visualize it for people. So those who haven't seen it, there's a catalog of strategies on the left, little blocks that you can select. And you've basically, based on the case that you're looking at, those strategies have been tested and sorted based off impact, ease of implementation, and sentiment, depending on if it's sentiment analysis on there or not, right? So that, to me, the first real benefit of this was you're telling me where to shoot first, right? Because as financial planners, we sit back and say to ourselves, okay, so I got to look at when I'm going to start taking money to the retirement accounts, when we're going to start doing the pension, when we're going to do this and that and the other thing. And we're going through our list of things to do, but we don't know what the most impactful thing is, right? So I was talking about this the other day where deferral of old age security in Canada, for example. Maybe it's number 2 to start, but by the time you implement number 1, it bumps to number 4. By the time you implement number 2, it bumps to number 6. And then like all this stuff I would have worried about as being important ends up moving the needle or being inconsequential to the needle altogether, right? So the fact that you're honing us in at like a caddy telling me exactly where you got to take that dog leg and make sure I hit it, that's the first thing. But so that's the first piece. And then the fact, of course, I activate one, it recalculates everything and tells me where to shoot next. Perfect. Let's talk about AutoSam.
Yeah. So AutoSam's interesting. How it came about is, even with the strategy list, when you're building, is context is king, right? And so the context and just basically the compounding nature of the strategy. So where do I start, but what do I do next? So using that CPP example, and this is how we got to AutoSam, was you can have that, it's an easy enough conversation to explain to a client that if you delay, you get more money. And this is how it works. But how do you actually, when should you do it and why you should do it? And so obviously, if you have the investments to bridge that gap, or you have other things in your portfolio to bridge that gap, that's the best place to talk about CPP and OAS deferral.
And Social Security shortly.
Especially in relation to someone who's, traditionally has a longer life expectancy. So AutoSam kind of came about from thinking about like where there is this nature of what is the next best decision and how you can put this together. And honestly, it really kind of speaks more to the core engine. The engine is actually doing all of that in the beginning. So AutoSAM starts in the engine, and there's an instant, like you said before, the strategies are all scored in real time, and all of that's done immediately. And that speaks to kind of the engineering of the actual platform. But AutoSAM came about as a way to say, what if we just had a button that the advisor could essentially click? It can look at and basically build the plan for you, suggest the next best strategy, look at things in the order of operations in terms of when they occur and the importance of the goals, and build this out. And as the advisor's working with it, or even if the client's potentially with them in the office, you still have the ability to go back and edit and change things and look at it. But it's essentially saying, since Sam has that overall view of the plan, overall view of the client situation, what if I just see what if it comes up with on its own? And so, we kind of played around with it, did some usability testing, did some UI work with it, and found that it was a really interesting way, especially it really hits the mark in mass affluent type of client.
Absolutely.
Obviously more complex wealth clients.
Well, also turns the actual solving for the plan into minutes versus hours, right? I mean, and I'll say even like the fact that you're already telling me like what optimal start age is, right, for certain things, right? Or what optimal funding level is. Like just the base use of without AutoSAM has shaved hours off our process, hours. And I also love to use a statistic that I think I've given you guys before, but in theory, right? I mean, like if you're looking at it in terms of the combination of number of start dates for CPP, old age security, and riffing between age 60 to 71, and this is the Canadian experience, but the same applies in the US with Social Security and RMDs. The reality is that you're looking at like 28 million possible combinations. Now, that's if you look at it on daily for riffs, but if you look at just even the start of the month, there's still 900,000 possible combinations. You're helping me create plans I never could have created before. Like that's the kick, right? Like, so basically, so that's Sam. We'll move on there. So that's the real, I think, star of the show in this. But I mean, there's so many other things about your platform, like your API out engineered. So basically, anyone can tie into anything. Your reporting engine's fantastic. Like it's very modern and sleek. And everyone even when I open it up, people are like, wow, that's very clean. That's very pretty. So let's leave product for a little bit. Let's move over to the business, right? And this is where Brad's going to jump in for quite a bit here. So Brad, I looked it up as to when the last time you guys were on, and it published August 18, 2020. And I'm pretty certain that I think we recorded there was like an announcement coming. So I think we delayed for a little bit, but I'm pretty sure it was like 2 months in advance almost. So we're talking beginning of summer 2020.
Yeah.
How big were you guys then back?
Well, I mean, there's a few different components of big, but maybe we can talk about the team as well as the business itself.
Yeah.
It is safe to say that you said it was August
2020.
2020. Yeah. We had 0 clients live on our platform in August of 2020.
No, you got guys like me in a boardroom saying, shut up and take my money. Get me this as soon as possible.
And so we've been working hard at taking people's money for a few years now.
Happily.
No, I think, as you said, like you talked about meteoric success. I think we've seen both from a people perspective as well as from a commercial perspective, some tremendous growth. Shortly after that podcast, people started seeing the announcement of our first client that we commercialized, which was IG Wealth and the group at IGM, who've been tremendous partners from the get-go. We've since been very public in our announcements around our partnerships with Sun Life and Canada Life and a number of other businesses in Canada. There's actually a couple of pretty major announcements that are about to hit, or that I guess as we release this podcast will have already hit, with our first Big Five bank in Canada, Royal. You can talk a little bit about that. Our expansion to the US, our partnership with Pershing.
Yeah, and in fairness, so like this is a telling one, and it's simply your US product is still like not fully it's in development, it's almost done, right? But at the same time, you landed the single biggest enterprise contract last year, a company that none of the competition had probably heard of yet. So kudos. I think that's a testament to just how differentiated you are in the product market.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to put it. You talked about the most competitive and probably largest RFP in the US space.
Yeah. In the largest market in the world with the most competition and 2 incredibly large entrenched players.
Yeah. And maybe we'll be humble and candid for a minute here, but for a while during that process, we didn't even realize how deep that competitive situation was and where we stood within it. We were really just showcasing the technology that we were servicing a very rapidly growing client base in Canada with. And there was some interest. There was some inbound interest from them to understand the platform, understand how it was different. And they've shown tremendous innovation and tremendous, let's call it pride and excitement about bringing something different to that US market. And through that process, we spent a lot of time socializing our platform with with a number of areas of that Pershing X business, traditional Pershing business, and they saw something incredibly different than what was currently serving the marketplace down there. And they loved a lot of the concepts we already talked about with respect to SAM, the efficiency we can drive to advisors. We didn't talk about this in the SAM section, but the idea of removing bias from the financial planning decision.
Totally. Yeah. The data is just there telling you if it works or not.
And the data is the other big one. And you'll see a lot of the public facing content around this partnership is around the interoperability. And for us to be able to tie so tightly into really an entire set of advisor solutions that are going to help them run their business.
I mean, it's a great project, right? It's like, let's take our custodial platform and build a digital layer over top where we get we integrate really deeply. I mean, to their credit, RBC Circle Black did something similar to this years ago and did a really good job there. And now I think Pershing's in the next level one of it potentially. So we'll see how it pans out. But so far, a good choice on the software.
Thank you. and not to mention our expansion to the UK. We were just talking about the business, right? So we're here in August of 2020. We're still trying to start to commercialize. We were about to announce our first partnership. We went live in November of that year. We've onboarded a number of businesses since and a number of great partners. But we launched in the UK last year in 2022. We're launching in the US here in the middle of 2023. So it's been rapid. Let's just use that word. And then from a people standpoint, I assume everyone remembers COVID on this podcast.
Yeah, no kidding. Talk about time to be launching a company. But
right. Well, and we had 23 people when COVID hit, and we had an office space in Winnipeg that obviously we had to exercise our DR policy very, very effectively and efficiently that day, and our business continuity plan. But at the same time, we had 23 people that all moved remote. We had thankfully finished, I believe, our seed and seed plus round around that time. So we did have some funding in the business to continue to expand it. But coming into COVID, we had over 100 people employed at Conquest. So rapid growth, obviously, from a commercial perspective, but from a people perspective, it's been insane as well.
Well, that's bonkers. I mean, like to add 80 bodies, basically to 5x the size of your staff in that short a period of time, let alone the fact that you're pretty developer heavy on that, right? So finding that talent's challenging, right? And I'm sure what they saw was exciting and a lot of them jumped at it. But the reality is that how do you, besides the basic organizational struggles, I mean, the good thing about being remote is you have to worry about finding desks for these people. But other than that, you have to worry about everything else, including the culture, and not just moving fast and hiring bodies for the sake of hiring bodies, but being strategic and wise with your hiring, because God knows how many technology companies have burned themselves out. Just get whoever we can in here.
So I think we've talked about this before, but I'm pretty fortunate we had the background of doing this before.
Yeah.
So, the original company sold in 2011, 2012, and the exit was what it was. But the good thing is that there was no bridges burned, at least in terms of the ex-employees, and partners have come back to the table and so on. But when it comes to the employee, we kind of make the joke that it's like 6 degrees of EISI in terms of how we're hiring people. And so we're hiring people that used to work for Mark and team before. We're hiring people who work with people who worked with people who worked for Mark before. But then we're also, as we continue to just expand our portfolio and expand our understanding of the market and make more and more contacts, people are coming to us and wanting to work, as you said before, something very exciting. So we haven't had a big issue, knock on wood, hiring people because, we're trying to build a culture that's very, very collaborative, very, very open. We're very upfront in terms of things like, this is the roadmap, this is what we're working on, this is what we're doing. We have a lot of people who, we have a very good referral policy that's come in. I mean, I don't know how many emails we get saying another successful referral, like so-and-so is coming on over. And we've just been very fortunate having done this before and having the history.
Ken keeps asking for his referral bonuses.
There you go.
People through the sales.
What brought you in, right?
There you go. That is true. We did meet when you were at Quovo. Anyway, so it's interesting, and it makes sense, right? Because you're talking about 6 degrees of separation. And the reality is that especially everything is a small village, and when you really boil it down to a small community, and especially I would say anyone who's got experience in coding or sales or support in the financial planning software, that is a very small ecosystem, right? People know each other and they know how to talk about how experiences were at different places or are at different places or what's competitive. So it's not surprising at all that goodwill that was in previous institution carried over to the new one.
Just give you a quick amazing story. It's not amazing because it happens to us every day. So my team will write product user stories, and they'll be anything from we're adding FHSAs to the application, we're adding 401ks, whatever it might be, to more functional stuff. But our development team is so strong in working with us on the user story. It's collaborative, not during the coding. It's collaborative when we're doing the estimating, the ballparking, the stories and stuff like that. Our QA team is I mean, they're right in there as well. So strong product team, development team that are not just, they're interested in coding, but they're interested in understanding what they're coding. And that's
well, this
huge.
is what I loved about like feedback with you guys is that you're a bunch of planning geeks. Like there was a time that we had like a 3-way call on like optimization of CPP, and we had this 30-minute conversation. By the end of it, we were all like, wow, like how many people could follow that conversation? That was awesome. Like it was just like, it was so high level. It was nuts. So great. So, okay.
They make my job easy too, right? Like
exactly.
I get to go to market with this amazing solution every day. We've kept our team reasonably lean, I would say, on the distribution side of the house. And that's been fairly intentional. We've been very, very targeted with the opportunities we've looked to source. And we've obviously had some inbound interest, but like,
but I think you're also a lesson.
So
it's just a great, you're a lesson in basically deployment, right? So there's a lot of softwares, again, they typically start with like especially in the advisor space, right? They start with an advisor having a problem. So they build a solution for themselves, and then they build a solution, then they start selling that solution to other people, right? And now you're scaling as almost as a B2B as opposed to an enterprise product, right? And that is a harder road. It's a grind. It's more sales and it's more staff that you'd have to staff up there. And especially in the early days, well, that's going to divert your attention. You've been very smart about targeting enterprise first as a conduit to move down market, as opposed to the other way around, which is incredibly challenging, right? So you're one of the examples I've actually used with startups where it's like, one of the first questions we always go around is, what's the target market? Is this an enterprise play versus direct to advisor play? Because, and more often than not, they always want to solve the advisor or client problem. And it's like, okay, I get that. And you can get there, but you can get there in one of two ways. One will get you the money to enable you to do the other thing. The other way is going to be harder to move up market later. And you guys have been an example I've used as when it's done right.
Oh, I appreciate that. I mean, we've definitely, as Ken has alluded to, we invest very, very heavily in the technology. And we believe that by building an amazing solution, we will win. We may limit ourselves in terms of the number of opportunities that we entered kind of within the first couple of years, but it paid dividends huge because we were just able to continue to invest in the technology. My team's incredibly effective at finding and sourcing the right opportunities. And sometimes, of course, they find us.
Well, it's a real struggle for startups, right? It's how much do you need that lead gen funnel desperately, right? But at the same time, if all you have limited resources, so you focus too much on that, well, you'll be able to deliver on what you promised. And that's countless companies failing at that.
And we found some amazing clients that have been forward thinking, that have been excited about being the first few, right? It's like any product trend, right? You have these early adopters and then you have these laggards and in between. But we've found such amazing early clients that want to be so bullish. Like we have folks that have helped us get into the traditional advice space. And I know you wanted to spend a little bit of time on kind of what's next in the future, but we have amazing clients that are partnering with us to service in a consumer initiated fashion now. And really, I would say expanding the area of a customer life cycle that we can hit within financial services. And it's just, we're incredibly excited about it.
Excellent. So, I mean, and so to answer the question I asked earlier, what's changed? Not just under 3 years now. And we're looking at a company going from 20 to over 100 and basically having zero revenue to paying enterprise clients in 3 different countries. Pretty meteoric. And now,
we can happily say we've increased our revenue stream by, I believe, infinity %.
Well, you can't divide by zero, right? Like, so you're like, no, you undefined percent. Thank you very much.
You earned that R in the chief revenue officer.
It took me a while.
Yeah, there we go. So, I mean, that's incredibly tough. But you also, I got to say, your timing, you had your Series A recently, and you ran into a very difficult time, right? Like that was post-market correction last year. Right. So what was that environment like? What was it like, despite the fact you had all the success, going out and everybody's purse strings are tightening?
Yeah, it was a totally different experience. We, again, are very fortunate in that we picked some, and I guess we're picked by some great dance partners back in the day. I think talked on the first podcast, we had already announced our initial fundraise. So I think we did that in the May timeframe of 2020 with Portage and with Fidelity, who are still here. And
for those who don't know, Portage is technically related to the Power Financial Corporation, which now you have Canada Life and IG in the mix. So again, you had enterprise client investors through their venture capital divisions.
Yeah. And it's obviously there's benefits to raising capital kind of early in a business life cycle. And I think there's some startups and maybe they're just not ready for the capital, but I've always been a huge proponent of raising early because I think there's strategic advantage to that. And I think we've executed on that strategic advantage. We're still fortunate enough to have them at the table. They participated in the most recent A round. We were able to add 2 other strategics to this round, which was, again, incredibly exciting and aligned very closely from a commercial mindset as well. So we added RBC Ventures and we added BNY Mellon Ventures as part of this experience. So again, like we've a very happy with the stable of partners we have from a venture perspective. It was a difficult process though, just getting through this fundraise. I mean, I'm always honest and straight with you, Jason.
Well, if it wasn't difficult, I would have thought you would be an incredible outlier.
Yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately, I know of several companies that basically had to shutter.
Yeah,
terribly, and then they had a good product, but they got caught.
Yeah, and fortunately, we were in a good position in our life cycle and in our financing that we could kind of draw the process out in a way that would actually work for our business, and we could get the right eventual raise and size, the right deployment of capital, so we weren't oversaturated, and the right mix of investors. And I think it was interesting because I forget what publication it was, might have been Wealth Professional, asked me some questions about just raising capital in this time, and you'd think about people trying to diversify, but it was actually a little of the opposite. They were almost being more insular, doubling down on the right checks. And so it was just a really interesting process. So we went through it. We were probably offered some check sizes that were far too significant for the business to absorb at that point.
Well, good on you for saying no, because that could be a freaking death wish.
Yeah. And we ended up in an amazing position, an amazing outcome. And we're ready to deploy the capital as we enter, our third market here in 2023. And we'll continue to grow the team in, I would say, a responsible way to support market demand and do what we need to do to continue to grow it as fast as we are.
Excellent. So I want to turn the focus back to the product for a bit. Well, actually, not even product. Let's talk about the growth challenges you've had on the tech side. So we talked about, luckily the people problem was largely solved through goodwill in the past and a lot of connections. So that worked out incredibly well. But let's talk about the scale issue of having to plan deployment across 3 different countries, right? And we've talked about this in the past, and I've always been I'm like, damn, that's how it's done. So talk to me about when you're trying to pick the next feature or the next thing you got to do. You've got 3 different markets to piece. How are you approaching this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So again, we have I'll call it the benefit of hindsight and what we did in the past. So in the past, we had 2 different versions per country. We had different clients, different client versions per client. So it ended up being 30, 40, 50 versions that were being tested. So we didn't,
man, that's a lot of testing for integrity, but continue.
But more importantly, what that does is it slows down on your generic development. You can't do anything. And what we end up doing is one country would get one feature, the other one would want it, and they'd never get it. There's just no time and capacity to do, especially when you're having to merge code back to versions that you no longer support. So that was, again, in terms of, what we wanted to do differently was the tech stack. And so kudos to Mark and the development team very early on when we were talking about this. They pitched this idea of the core spine and the foundational build, right? Which is essentially, there are some very similar concepts, and no matter what country you go to, every country has cash flow, every country has income tax, every country has tax deferral.
And there's only so many tricks.
There's only so many tricks.
Yeah, this is one of the realizations I had taking the CFA when we got into the third stage was this is they did a tax section, and I'm looking through it all, and it's okay, there's only so many tricks here. And actually, one of the realizations I had at the time was that a multi-jurisdictional financial planning software is viable if you basically engineer it properly.
Yeah.
Then you meet you guys a couple of years later.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I mean, probably the biggest one that kind of triggered all this was pensions, right? Government pensions. It's very similar in every single place that you go to. I mean, we're fortunate. We have 2.
Yeah.
If you count old age security as one
pension,
of them. It's not really a pension, but you throw it in there. But in the grand scheme of things, that type of thing started us going down the path of let's build a core foundational build that's relatively agnostic. The benefit of that is we think about new features that are applicable everywhere. We can build it once and it would apply across all of them. Then the obviously next challenge was with respect to how we architected was how do you localize, right? And so essentially there's a section controlled by your user ID, but our core build that we have is essentially your user ID can have access to the US engine, the Canadian engine, the UK engine, and then whatever country we go into the future. And then really the only difference is hosting, right? Because obviously as you host in different jurisdictions, they want to be, servers got to be there, right? And GDPR and all.
Okay, GDPR, sure, but I can also tell you how PEPIDA doesn't forbid that. And there's a bulletin on the site, yet no one seems to read it.
Yeah, but everyone asks for it and love it, which is fine for us because it's just about the deployment model.
You're just sure, it doesn't matter, but we'll give you what you want.
But for us, it then for me on our product team, is we can look at things relatively straightforward. We can do agnostic functionality, which is probably where we spend a lot of our time. So things like our volatility analysis, which will be out by the time this podcast rolls. Everybody gets it.
Yeah.
Any UI changes we make, we recently moved to inline data entry. We'll talk about self-directed in a bit too.
Oh, yes.
A lot of things like that are very key, and we can do once, and everybody gets it. Generally at the same time. Sometimes, things like our estate planning that we're building out right now, the framework of it is generic, but obviously US and Canada and UK all have slightly different ways to handle the state. US being obviously the most complicated.
You don't say.
Yeah.
Jesus.
But we built it before, so it's nothing that we're necessarily that it will be in the application.
Yeah,
but
it's just something that no one would have ever made that on purpose.
No kidding.
Anyway, continue.
Yeah, no, all good. And then so how we think about things is then we worry about specific features per country. And so so there is a Canadian team, there's a UK team on the development side, there's a US teams, and then we can also then separate things out that still look to the larger picture for integration, our business intelligence initiatives, our admin portals, and then our client portal, self-directed planning applications can all work. And so we have enough developers, like you said, I wouldn't say we're development heavy. We're very focused on development skewed maybe, but it's intentional. And so each team has a product owner, each team helps guide that development team what we want to work. And then we're very deliberate. And so we have our larger global roadmap in terms of what we want to do. We share with everybody. And then we have jurisdictional roadmaps that we work within. And then we work pretty closely with development evangelists resources, but it all speaks to the architecture of the system and this foundational approach that we can actually build each country into the core application. And there's no crossover. We actually just I don't want to say for fun, but deliberately turned Spanish on in the US application because we actually built a tool into the US application. But it didn't take us as long as we thought. And so in theory, the application right now, you can run Canadian English, Canadian French, US English, US Spanish, and then the Queen's English, of course, right? So you can add more U's there, right? Yes. But it's
more U's and R's moved around.
The King's English, sorry, I should say that, right? King's English.
And that was with a K for some stupid reason, but continue.
Yeah. But anyways, but it's allowed us to kind of not have to rob Peter to pay Paul. We can actually allow all our clients in every single country to continue getting this stuff.
And that's what it allows our clients to experience global innovation as well, right? Like I remember the amount of times that we've had discussions in previous businesses at customer advisory boards where it would be like, okay, well, help me understand what's happening in this other region because you support this other region. Now it's just literally like this global pool of innovation, and we try, as Ken said, to make it as consistent as possible.
Yeah, and I mean it's one of the things that people have asked me in the past when talking about you is like, oh well, they're going to the US now, they're going to be focused on Canada. It's like, well, if you're running two separate instances, I understand has a channel conflict. When you're running one system like you guys have done, which it's like everything trickles down from the core from the core engine, and it's just, like, for lack of a better term, I'm going to simplify it. It's tools there, the rule sets to get overlaid, and voila, Bob's your uncle. You're good for that jurisdiction. It's viable, right? And also being engineered for multi-jurisdictional from day one. I mean, this is the big thing is that number of times I get calls and like, oh, thinking of coming to Canada, what would that look like? And it's like, well, let's start talking. You do tax calc, right? Like, okay, so you're talking a full rebuild.
Is it in French?
Is it in French, right? Like, can you support multiple languages, right? Like, these are things that, there's only 3 companies I know of that have ever sold financial planning software outside of their own jurisdiction effectively. And 2 of them were born in Canada. So it's no surprise, us being a smaller market, that happens. When you start in the US, your market's so big, I don't blame you for not looking at it anywhere else. But at the same time, there's a lot of learning elsewhere. So well done. Okay, so you already alluded to in terms of the self-directed piece. So I'm going to take a little interlude and talk about, again, a key kind of direction of the industry. And I always, there's very few thinkers out there on this subject better than Joe Durant over at Goldman, formerly of United Financial. And one of the things I saw him talk about at WellStack was about kind of the vision for how this should work in the future. And it's basically a unified platform whereby whether someone's on a DIY platform or a robo-advisor, that basically, or getting almost like the family office level, that all points in between, that it's a graduation system whereby they start off with it, but they're on the same platform, right? All the same core platform and experience pieces. You're not going from a DIY system with a very simplified calculator to, okay, now I need all your information when you graduate to the next level to do an actual financial plan. Oh, no, now I need your really deep information because I'm doing like the super advanced estate plan because now you're worth a fortune, right? It should be a natural transition between those. Of course, most technology tends to focus in on one specific user type or use case. Talk to me about what you've done along the lines of enabling a vision like this.
So we scale in 2 ways. And that's the biggest thing. So from a functionality perspective, our tool is built, and I'll talk about on the advisor side, and I'll talk about the organizational side. So on the advisor side, the tool is built to scale from the most simple mass market plans. Very easy to start a plan in Conquest. You basically need income, like potentially a goal and an account. And Sam will kick in and start giving suggestions. And obviously in today's data age, the more data you can pull in, even if you do manually entered stuff like that, but aggregation, stuff like that, you get that data in, the more Sam sings. And as a plan scales up in complexity, we are built to support that. So we have full business planning support in Canada, working on estate planning, all 3 countries will have that same functionality. So as an advisor or even a firm, you have a retail side, you have a banking side, you have a wealth side. The tool is built to do that. And the benefit of that is not just it's one planning tool that you have to train and have people use. Just think about it from the client life cycle and the data that goes through, right? You have the plan at the very first time they hit into the system, all the way up to hopefully they become a wealth client if that happens, or even family members are wealthy on one side and others are not.
It's also, I mean, I will say the fact that going back, like the MVP of like what this looks like, someone comes in without investments, it's literally, what do you make? How much do you have free? Give me your dates of birth, right? In theory, Sam can start working off that, right? And I think the value of having that unbelievably low friction point is the ability to start demonstrating very quickly the value that can be brought to the table, right? Oh, like now you're with just that, you're able to give me this. Yes. Well, if you gave me a lot more, like the data, what I can do to help you is substantial. So I think it's the entire like showing, people still don't understand what financial planning is in general because the industry, blame banks, but whatever, does a terrible job of basically making us all look very vanilla and very simple and everything, financial advice, everything's financial advice. But a financial plan, fortunately, most polls have proven people don't understand what one looks like. The funniest poll was one in Canada a couple of years ago where it was 50% Canadians said they had one, which was hilarious. 30% of that group of 50% said that it was in their head. And when you actually broke down, I think it was JD Power and Associates actually broke down like what percentage is like, it's like around 7% of Canadians who actually have one. I still think that's probably double what it should be, what it actually is. So people just don't get it. But I think the ability to demonstrate in that minimum viable product is incredibly powerful in terms of graduating them up the experience.
Well, and you'll notice in a lot of the language we use, we don't talk about financial plans per se. We talk about financial advice, wellness.
Planning is a verb, not a noun, like I keep saying.
Yeah, exactly, right. And planning's iterative, and planning is over a lifetime. And so I think where you're going to see a lot of Conquest, obviously, will continue to grow on the traditional advice side, but in these opportunities where you have large financial institutions that are trying to service a very disparate set of clients, but give them similar service, right? Do it at scale. Those are opportunities that we're excited about because, again, we can get wellness and guidance into hands of consumers that maybe need it earlier in their life cycle, and potentially, again, as Ken said, kind of advance to a more advice-centric need later on down the stream. And we're seeing that in, as I said, large financial institutions, kind of retail bank into wealth, or also the workplace. So we're seeing there's a lot of interest in.
Well, everybody's got a retirement plan. Not everybody, but I mean, retirement plans exist all over the Canada and the US, right? So, and to date, most of the calculators I've seen just tend to be some very simple goals-based calculator, very little value, right? It's just like, tell me what it is, they'll make assumptions on pensions. Tell me what it is you want to spend. Here's your progress bar.
Well, that's where I was getting the second part of how we scale. So like I said, just to recap, the first part is on the complexity of the client and so on. So now the second part that we really scale is on, as Brad was alluding to there, is the ability to get a plan or get an idea of what a plan could be into someone's hands that much faster. So we scale on the client, I'll call it client segmentation maybe. So we've recently rolled out a group planning version of the application. We're just doing some additional UI work. So that this group planning version, self-directed, essentially do-it-yourself planning, is built for essentially a client to log in. They can self-authenticate, and we can talk about how we embed this into larger ecosystems in a bit. But essentially, I can get in, I can start entering my data, or more specifically, we can pull the data that the firm has on you, and the client can start getting in to understand. And we've been very deliberate to do it literacy first, because we'll admit there's a literacy problem in the world, and when it comes to financial literacy problem. And this allows a client to actually log in, enter in their information, and do some very simple planning. And firms can control the level of strategies, they can control the level of information, but essentially a client can understand enough about their situation. And then essentially at the point in time, whether it's the client making the decision or the firm going, hey, we have an opportunity to help this person here, that plan can be promoted up into what we'll call our hybrid version. Typically where we've seen that deployed thus far are firms that kind of have like a call center, but you could even take it to scale it back as an example to allow. So it could be part of a call-in center where clients could essentially be working with an advisor at a call center to answer questions about their plan. Or if it's a prospecting flow, if they're using it in that way, the client can request some information or request some additional help. And that itself can then be promoted up into the traditional channel that we all know today and kind of how we built the initial Conquest. And so it's, like I said, we're trying to tackle it in two ways, scaling on the complexity of the client, but also scaling from where the client might start. And so it becomes this
right down to prospecting potentially, right? And
potentially,
and the thing is, and I want to clarify, what you're doing here is not creating a direct-to-consumer financial planning software, which, by the way, I've been pitched every 6 months since I started this podcast. And I have said everybody's always saying the same thing. Oh, no one's done this. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because of all the dead bodies lying around. Like they all tried and failed miserably. I think what you're doing is you're not providing a full-blown software suite. You're providing some contextual advice based on some simplified stuff at a level that even an absolute neophyte can probably wrap their heads around, right? And it's, and this buttresses into a conversation I have with clients and countless advisors where they look at AutoPlan and they're like, oh my goodness, is the client going to need me? And it's like, do you think the client is going to take the recommendations from a computer that they don't really wrap their heads around, that they don't understand what this thing is saying, how it really impacts their lives, right? And, you listen to just about most of the people I respect in the US, they're saying like, our future is financial coaching and implementation and all this stuff.
Well, it's the WebMD problem.
Well, this is exactly. But the thing is that like the heavy lifting has never been our value, right? Like even if the software tells me produces a better plan than I could, let's just say that's the case. I'm not going to win, but it's not going to do that. Anyway, so say it does. It does help me be better. Or first and foremost, helps me be better. But the thing is that even if it produces the perfect plan, right? It means nothing without implementation. It means nothing without basically being able to square the gray matter in that person's head with the output and making sure that if it doesn't square because of behavioral preferences, life events, whatever it is, how do I accommodate for that? So we are the bridge, right? And if anything, again, people used to say, I can't believe it. People used to say like, well, clients think they got to fill out all this paperwork every year. What a low value thing to be selling, right? Like, so I'm not afraid of that. But so we're not looking direct to consumer. We're looking at, again, the bicycle for the mind analogy that Steve Jobs basically made, right? Like you're basically giving me the ability to pedal faster and get people further.
We want to pedal faster. I mean, you're giving the consumer, let's talk about the prospecting vein. We're giving the financial professionals more information to enter their first conversation with the consumer, right?
They've already put stuff in.
Pre-qual, I think there's a lot of stats out there that say that the buyer in any industry knows about 75% of the buying decision before they actually enter the ring, so to say. There's just so much information out there, and this is we see a gap, right? And Ken talked a little bit about that segmentation. Today, if you go to a financial institution, you're probably going to let's say you're a prospect, you're going to a public-facing site, you're using a calculator. Maybe you do actually want a conversation with a financial professional. You come back to that conversation, they're using a different calculation source.
Yeah.
And so the process is just so segmented and fragmented today that it creates challenge.
Well, it really does. And it's interesting. And a friend of the show, previous podcast guest, Sean Brayman said, like, was talking about examples that were done where the same case was taken in multiple places and the results came back were so diverse. And I mean, there's so many different inputs that go into it, assumptions, biases, whatever, right down to projection assumptions, right? Even if you standardize projection assumptions, you still got to get different results from different people. And, but now it's okay if it's a little bit off and the recommendations are slightly different. But if they're night and day recommendations, it's like going to two different doctors and getting like a diagnosis that you're fully healthy and the other one that you're going to die tomorrow, right? Like it doesn't really help the industry at all. So I think the ability to basically, like we've done with the technologies, extract that bias and do that other stuff is going to help in terms of at least anyone who's using Conquest get something that's a lot more like just here's the data and this is what fits. Now let's fit the person to it.
Well, and it aligns with our ethos, right? We've talked about our ethos from the start being to get more people into financial plans, like totally. Or into financial advice. I'm breaking my own rule. No,
so I'll tell you. So the funny thing is that I don't remember this. When we first met in Ottawa over drinks, when you were at an urban banking conference, I was at a tax conference.
Old fashions.
And we were talking about, I was like, oh, you guys should come on the podcast. And you kind of like, at one point, he's like, can we just talk about the value of financial planning? I'm like, but dude, you're in a data aggregation company, right? Like, because you worked in so you even when you left, you still knew the power of that. And that's one of the things that really, like, when you switched over to Conquest, I'm like, okay, this makes sense. So before we wrap up, one last thing before we get into the final questions, but last topic to cover, it's, okay, that's a lot of ground to cover in 2 years. Where do you see this going in the next little while?
Well, I mean, I'll talk a little bit from the business side and then maybe we can turn it to Ken. I think everyone's always excited about product enhancement as it relates to like, where do we go next? But I think
my long list of demands, but continue.
Yeah, no, we'll get to all of them.
They're knocking them all down.
Yeah. No, I think from a headline level, like we are excited about the global expansion of the tool. We're excited about, again, learning more as we enter new regions. We're extremely bullish on our entry into the US. We understand it's a very red ocean as far as technology.
Cutthroat red ocean,
yeah. But we'll pick the right knife fights, and we believe, again, I believe in the technology tremendously to enter any of those battles. I think we've already shown some success in the US, as you mentioned.
Every person I've ever shown it to has been super excited.
Well, and plus the largest, again, competitive situation that we were already successful in. So I think for those that are listening to the podcast from the US and have interest, we would love to hear from you. We want to get an initial group and quorum together, get great feedback, similar to how we released it in Canada. We run to feedback. We don't shy away from feedback. That's really been a tenet of, and one of the reasons we've been so successful at building an amazing product so efficiently. So we're excited about that. We continue to be excited about the UK market. And then ultimately our roots are here in Canada, right? So we're going to continue to evolve the solution and grow our client base here and ultimately serve more Canadians. So I'll maybe turn to Ken on the product side.
Product side, sure. So I think the thing we're most excited about right now is the self-directed piece that we just talked about. I mean, that it's actually going to...
Oh, I took one look at it and said, make this a lead gen tool, please. You're like, oh, we're planning on that.
Planning on that, yeah. And one of the biggest reasons for that is, and we've kind of we've mentioned it in different ways during the entire podcast, but is we look to embed Conquest in the ecosystem of the partners that we work with. We don't want to waterfall our product and say, good luck. It's about how can we understand better how advisors and financial professionals are working with their clients today, and then have Conquest be agile itself to work within their ecosystem. So that's a big part of it. There's obviously a large feature roadmap of stuff. We alluded to some of this on the call, volatility coming, and there's our estate planning modules in all 3 countries that will come out. That's going to be very exciting in terms of how we have Sam look at that and touch on things. There's some UX redesign that we constantly do. We try to do a very good job of not just worrying about users who are in the system, but new users entering the system. The other big one is expanding. What I'll call is kind of expanding Sam a little bit and plan quality. So that's another area that we're looking at is how can we use our Sam to, yes, it looked at strategies and suggest things, but what about what a plan should be? What about a good plan? What about looking for additional opportunities? What about identifying potential problems with the plan that much sooner? So I think plan quality is going to be a big thing, will be a big thing for us as we continue to kind of look at for different ways to guide and make it easier for the advisor. You don't want to have to go through audit. Maybe, I don't know, sometimes you like it, but you don't want to go through audit report after audit report, trying to hunt down a number and go, why does it do this? But what if you could potentially ask Sam or have Sam identify is that, you know what, you accidentally are redeeming in this year earlier, or maybe you enter in a savings amount that was the wrong frequency. Like that, those things happen. It happens in every single software. We want to automate that to make it easier, that those are the things you don't have to worry about. So that's a big thing that we're continuing to look at among, again, like I said, self-directed and other pieces.
Absolutely. All right. So before we wrap up, there's 3 questions I ask everyone. So here we go. First one. If you had one wish for something to change in your company or the industry as a whole, what would it be? Who wants to go first?
You say open banking?
Why don't you go first?
Oh, Jesus. Let's not get... Oh.
Make me start on that one.
Where's the Scotch bottle?
No, you go first.
One thing to change. I forget how I answered this question back in August of 2020. Probably going to answer it differently.
You just wanted revenue back then. So
yeah, I needed revenue back then. No.
Everybody freezes here because it's a really tough one. I should probably make it the last one, but then the podcast would never end.
I mean,
you can come back to it if you want.
Yeah. Why don't we circle?
I'll circle back.
Yeah.
Okay. So question number 2, what's the biggest challenge in the company to where it is today?
I can go on this one for sure. So I think we talked a little bit to it earlier, but like scale is going to be, the largest challenge for us. We're in a much different situation than we were when we first sat down a few years ago. But it is some of the tenets that you talked about, maintaining that quality. Ken talked about kind of the 6 degrees of EISI, making sure that we're making the right decisions as we expand the business and bringing the right people into the organization that have the same general ethos and principles that we have kind of within the founding group around making financial planning more accessible. That's going to continue to be a challenge because as we continue to distribute into these additional regions, the teams are only going to have to grow to satisfy the need and market demand. And so I don't think something that's unachievable, but it's certainly something we need to be mindful of.
Good stuff. Okay. Is that the same answer? Or?
I mean, it can be. I mean, I always think about the Coke Pepsi problem. And I think that that's a challenge is that in Canada, we've done a pretty good job of explaining and highlighting the benefits of using Conquest and moving to Conquest and doing that change management. US, it'll be interesting because there's a lot of incumbents that have been there for a long time.
Well, I think the way your approach represents is a bit of a paradigm change to how planning works altogether, right? And the problem is when the earth moves underneath you, sometimes you don't realize that's happened, right? So the common questions I've heard is, well, why not just continue to use pick on e-money, for example, right? It's like, they're embedded into my enterprise and whatever. Okay, well, there's net benefit. Now the question becomes, if you ripped it out and took that much pain, what net benefit do you have going forward on this? And I think it's a substantial and valid replacement if you want to look at that.
Yeah. And we talked about the scalability of the type of planning in the app as well as the technology piece of it. And that's where We want to continue that, build a lot of things around that. It's going to take a little bit of time. I think it's a challenge, but I think it's a good challenge because we can highlight the benefits of moving to Conquest. We can highlight the benefits of that. And hopefully we change some minds that this will help you get more people in financial plans. It's good for everybody.
Excellent. So question 3, and we'll come back to question 1. Question 3 is basically, okay, startups and entrepreneurship in general it can be a real drag and make you question yourself. What keeps you getting out of bed in the morning to keep on fighting the good fight that is growing this thing?
I love what we do. And I love the fact that everyone in our company is passionate. Like we were talking on kind of the way over and we both flew into Toronto last night, but basically, not to get all sappy, but seeing someone like Mark's passion, like he did this before. He was successful.
Mark's like a happy puppy every time I see him. He's like a kid in a candy store out, like living out his life ambition.
and I'm not just saying this to kind of like, I don't want to use the word suck up or whatever it is, but it's infectious across our organization because everyone there has a passion to be there and we want to keep building and it's so much fun, man. Like we talk about this all the time.
Talk about it. I mean, like, but it makes sense. It's a leadership thing. If the guy at the top is having the time of his life, how does that not resonate down?
How does it not? Right? Yeah. And he's in the app and he's looking at like it. Those stuff is just infectious.
He's in the weeds of small problems, but also at the same time, high level plan. Like it's just.
But the implicit trust of the team that's around him, like it's great. And again, we're lucky.
Yeah.
So
it's a great position to be. Brad?
Yeah, I would echo the team. Like I just can't say enough about the group that's been around the solution, helped build Conquest to date. We've talked a little bit about the fact that we quintupled in size from a people perspective and through a pandemic, and people that like care. I had an old boss that always said you should actually be excited about Mondays, and I don't want to say every day is a Monday at Conquest because I'm sure we do need to support a work-life balance, but at the same time I think people care so much about what we're doing.
You get excited over the weekend of what you're doing on Monday.
Everyone's committed to the process.
I hear you. All right, back to question 1. You've had enough time now.
Do I have to answer this one? One thing to change.
The one thing to change in your company or the industry as a whole, what would it be?
I was thinking about that one before. So the big thing is, I think I don't know the best way to articulate this, but I'll give it a shot. It is that Coke Pepsi problem. It's that there's a lot of history and a lot of reaction to I've always done it that way. I've always done it. So, I mean, if there was a magic button to just be like, be open-minded, be open, be willing to say like, am I doing everything I can to work in the best interest of my client? Whether or not it's moving to Conquest, whether or not it's looking at other technologies out there, whether or not it's different things that you can do to offer, whether it's a new fee structure, right? Just be open-minded to the fact that, and I'm a big believer in this. Like everyone loves the movie Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
Right. So if you can open up your mind to not be worried about, the trailing fees and the mirror on and you can actually be like, if we build things, if we offer products, if we offer advice, we offer things that's in the best interest of the client, that's actually going to get more people in the plans because people will see the benefit. Like I'll tell you, my dad was a doctor for the longest time. He wasn't comfortable with financial planning because you're asking someone to trust you and look at it, and all you do is hear about the horror stories.
And of course, they're worried about judgment and any number of things. And the number of clients who've admitted they're embarrassed about a situation, and you got to try to get them out of that mindset as quickly as possible.
So if there's a way to change just the way firms and some advisors, there's a lot of good advisors, a lot of great advisors out there. Just approach it. I think again, if you build it, they will come, and people will be more willing to accept financial advice from financial professionals.
Absolutely. Well, that's preaching to the choir, but continue. Your turn. Now on the spot.
Now I'm on the spot. I echo everything Ken says. I think I'm struggling to answer this question. What he said. No, I think there's a lot of things that would be great to fix. Just generally, we preach access to advice. I think that's one of the things that I would maybe suggest or lean into is that with some of the new capabilities that we're bringing with self-directed and kind of how that trees up. I would encourage firms to look at getting advice in consumers' hands earlier and allow consumers to almost qualify themselves into channels instead of trying to lump consumers into channels. So it's kind of a similar answer to Ken, but more on the consumer side than on the, just
I agree. I would also say that it's going to require reframing your thinking around providing the level of education of when that leap needs to happen, right? Like that's the issue, right? Like there absolutely are some people come to me and say, I want to work with you, and I'll look at their case and say, honest truth is it's so simple that the fees I charge probably don't make any sense to you, right? That's the reality of it. And I will, if you want to engage me, this is fine. This is the price. Otherwise, I'm happy to refer you somewhere else, right? And it's just a matter of, again, knowing when it is valuable, when that advice can be actually implemented and valuable. But anyway,
one other thing to change, I just came to me.
Oh, there we go.
We should do this more than every 3 years. So maybe
feel free to sponsor the podcast. I'll give you an annual spot. Anyway,
check in back by Conquest.
Yeah,
excellent. All right, gents, as always, a pleasure.
Thanks,
We're going to wrap it up. So that was today's interview with the guys from Conquest Planning. Hope you enjoyed that. Like I said, I was impressed from day one, and big things have happened and will continue to happen. So take the time to check them out. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, take care.
This podcast was brought to you by Woodgate Financial, an award-winning financial planning firm catering to high net worth individuals and their families. To learn more, go to woodgate.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, or